Hello everyone, and this is Marcio Cardoso with another political hot take video tied to education reform. This is our sixth video, and it's going to be tied to school funding and how we should fund our schools. It won't tie into teacher funding and teacher pay and all that. I'm going to have a separate video. My next video will be on teacher funding and teacher salaries. But that's the next video. This funding is about how we fund our schools in basically every way, shape, or form aside from teacher salaries. And there's a lot of way to fund schools and give schools money aside from giving the money to us great teachers. So let's look into it a bit here. How we fund our schools as opposed to maybe how we should fund our schools. This has been something that's been going on for a while now, but it was really accelerated in the early 2000s by President George W. Bush. Remember him? President George W. Bush instituted No Child Left Behind. He signed into law No Child Left Behind. And you might think, oh, No Child Left Behind, great. No, it wasn't that simple. What it did is it created a competition out of public schools, which, as I've said before in other videos, is not a good idea. I don't think you should have a competition with public schools. Public schools are not private enterprises. They're a public service. And a private enterprise is different than a public service. If you want to have competition with private schools, fine, but not with public schools. It's a service that's provided for everybody. But what No Child Left Behind did is just that. It created a competition. Schools had to take standardized tests, which they were already doing before, but they had to take standardized state-level exams at the end of the year. And whichever schools had the best performance, whichever schools students did the best job, those schools would get more money. And schools where the test scores weren't so good, they got less money. And it created this gap in wealth. And we've been talking about in these education videos about the achievement gap and how certain students are learning or performing really better than another group of students. And typically what happens is the students that perform better happen to be in schools, ironically, that have more money to play around with, more money to go to funding for all kinds of programs, and also, which we'll touch in our next video, more money for teachers too. But again, this is mainly about funding for the schools and for programs and for students and whatnot. Well, No Child Left Behind expired recently. Actually, a couple years ago, President Obama let it expire. And needless to say, it's not coming back anytime soon because President Trump has consistently said that he is not a big fan of No Child Left Behind. Interestingly enough, he's also not a big fan of Common Core, which is kind of what replaced No Child Left Behind. To me, though, we still haven't resolved the funding gap between schools. Even though No Child Left Behind is gone, the Common Core rules that have come into our educational system, I don't think change things a whole lot. Common Core is basically this new set of standards that teachers have to teach and students learn by. But again, similar to No Child Left Behind, you have the test, the big test at the end of the year called the Smart and Balanced Assessment. And basically what happens is the schools that do better on these assessments tend to get additional funding, or do get additional funding. I don't think we can do that. Here's what I think needs to happen. I think that funding in terms of public schools should be purely based on a per pupil basis or per student basis, period. End of discussion. End of discussion. So allocate funds to each school based on a per pupil basis. So let's say there's a school in suburban Illinois. I'm going to use that as an example. Let's say there's a school in suburban Illinois, maybe 10, 15 miles away from Chicago. And then let's say there's another school inside inner city Chicago. Let's say they're both high schools and they both have similar enrollments. They each have a couple thousand kids. I believe those two schools should be getting identical funding. The amount of money that each school gets should be equal. Period. That's what I believe. That's not what happens right now. I forget when it happened, but there was this little series, on a certain episode on the Oprah Winfrey Show back when it was running, and they compared two schools from the areas I just mentioned. They compared a school from inner city Chicago to a school in the Chicago suburbs. And as you probably can assume, the suburban school was state of the art, brand new everything. The inner city school, very little. And then they showed at the end of that documentary the funding levels, and the suburban school got way more in funding, way more. And that's a problem. We can't do that. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, you're punishing the suburban school because maybe the suburban school has better test scores and better students and whatnot. Once again, public education is a public service. It's a good. It's a public good. You shouldn't be competing. You shouldn't be differentiating. You shouldn't be unbalanced. You shouldn't be unequal when it comes to public education. Unequal. What does it sound familiar? Oh, that's right. Equal. For those of you who don't know, a couple weeks ago, Linda Brown passed away. Who's Linda Brown? And maybe the words Brown versus Board of Education ring a bell. Linda Brown was that person. Her and her family in the mid-1950s went to fight against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, because they basically said separate isn't equal. She wanted to be enrolled in what was at the time a white school because her father said, look, the white schools provide more. The black schools don't. But at the time, the United States had a law that said, well, we can keep everything separate as long as everything is equal. We can keep the races separate as long as everything is equal. Well, the Supreme Court determined in Brown versus Board that separate is not equal. And we need to, first and foremost, desegregate, but also make sure that things are equal. Equal. And that's the word I'm trying to get to, equal. And it's the same thing here. We're going back to the similar situation. Is it a coincidence that the inner city school in Chicago, in the Oprah show that was mentioned, was predominantly black? I don't think it's a coincidence. The suburban school in the Chicago suburbs was predominantly white. And the funding gaps were enormous, clearly enormous. Kind of like what you saw in the 1950s in Kansas, in Topeka. And we can't have that. We got to have funding equal based on per student. Even if the suburban Chicago school in the Chicago suburbs performs better, I don't think that means that more money should be warranted to them from a state funding or federal funding level. If parents want to donate, if let's say parents of the students in the Chicago suburban school, they're well off, they want to donate extra money to the school, it's a little bit different. Like, I get that. School donations, take that. Fundraisers, okay. But we literally have state-sponsored, federal-sponsored, certainly local-sponsored funding setups to where that Chicago suburban school, that school in the Chicago suburbs is going to get more money from the state level and from the federal level than the school in inner city Chicago. That shouldn't happen. From a funding level at the federal level and the state level and the local level, the funding of those two schools should be the same. The only reason why one school should get more money than the other, based on a state or federal funding setup, is if one school has more students. Obviously, the school with more students should get more money because you got more kids. Other than that, the funding should be equal, period. If anything, there should be a setup to where students from lower economic backgrounds should get more money. The poor kids should get more money. The schools with more poor kids should get more money. A Title I school, which is basically a school where a large number of its students come from impoverished backgrounds, if anything, should get more money than a non-Title I school, at least from a state or federal funding setup. And that's not what happens. Title I schools will sometimes get little stipends and bonuses because of their status, but they don't get enough. If you want to keep state testing at the end of the year, that's fine. So we can let people know, let the public know how the school's performing. So parents can decide, do they want to try to send their kids there? One of my earlier videos talks about school choice, which I believe in some aspects should exist. Well, if the parent knows how that school's performing, then they can choose if they want to send their student there accordingly. So state testing at the end of the year, you want to keep that in place, fine. But don't tie your funding setup to it. You gotta leave that separate. You gotta have the funding of these schools to be based on a per pupil basis, period. End of discussion. And if anything, schools with more poor students should get even more money than schools with wealthy students, because even if you cut funding at a wealthy school, they're going to find a way to make it work. Parents are going to help out their kids at home. Parents might volunteer their time or their money, and that's fine, and they'll make up the loss. But you cut funding at a Title I school, a school with many poor children, lower economic children, they're going to fall further and further and further behind. We can't do that. We've got to keep the funding equal. And funding, quite frankly, should be raised. The United States does not spend as much money on education on a per pupil basis as many other industrialized countries do. So I think we should increase our funding to pretty much all of our schools, especially the schools that need it the most. We don't fund our school system the way that other industrialized countries do. But what's most criminal of all is what we do fund, it's not funded proportionally. It's not funded equally. It tends to go towards the suburban schools. It doesn't go to the inner city schools. Just walk into a suburban high school and then walk into an inner city high school and you'll know the difference right away. You got to balance that funding out, at least from the state and federal funding setup. You do that, you're going to give students from poor economic backgrounds a better chance. And if you do that, you'll go a long way in closing the achievement gap, in my opinion anyways. But what do I know? You see, I've worked at a couple of schools already. One, you could say, has more money than the other because it's based in a I want to say affluent area, but it's definitely based in a more affluent area as opposed to the other. And as a result, it has more money. And shocker, students, they do better. And I don't think it's because the quality of teaching at the more affluent school is better than the other school. Some people will say, oh, the teachers are better. I don't think so. The teachers at the school that I currently work with are good, by and large. So were the teachers at my former school, by and large. They were also pretty good. There's other differences that are at stake here, at play here. And a big one is funding. There's more money at the school that I'm at now than my previous school. And that makes a big, big difference. And I know if my previous school had the same amount of money as my current school does, my previous school, they'd be doing that much better. So we need to have a balance put in place to keep funding equal on a per pupil basis. If we do that, we can go a long way towards closing that achievement gap and fixing our educational system in this country. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.